I'll get started. So I'm Geoff Reville. My contact details up there if you're hopefully interested enough at the end of the day to want to stay in contact. I'd be more than happy to follow up with any conversations you want to take forward. I'm the founder of a company called Krowdthink. We've just put an app onto the App Store called The Crowd. I'm not going to talk about The Crowd at all today. It's irrelevant to this discussion. What I will be talking about is the kind of culture and thought processes behind the company, because in order to facilitate fundamental change in the digital society, we have a fundamental belief that the only way that that occurs is through competition. Regulation is useful, nudges things in the right direction, doesn't actually solve anything. And technology is great, but it doesn't necessarily change things. It's about the way in which companies embrace the technology, companies embrace regulation, and the companies create cultures inside their organizations that can fundamentally shift the way in which internet engagement can occur. So that's what I want to be talking to you guys about today. So a little bit about myself, just if I hope you don't mind. I think it might be useful context. Got a degree in computer science. I specialised in natural language understanding and real-time systems. I did 30 years ago natural language interfaces to databases. So it's lovely to see our phones finally starting to use the technology I was thinking about 30 years ago, so it's great. And I moved from that into the software space. I was sponsored by Marconi Communication. I did a lot of software infrastructure stuff. The very first digital exchange I worked on, System X. I did the fundamental low-level protocols for X.25, which was one of the first internet protocols that people were actually using to connect to the internet, so kind of early days stuff, some fun stuff. And I moved through that much more to the commercial side, because I got bored with programming, to be totally honest. I found it a bit boring. I kept feeling that everyone had already done what I was being told to do, so much more interested in trying to do stuff that people weren't already doing. So I went into the commercial side and built up several companies for American entities, kept getting acquired, eventually ended up in Silicon Valley, like so many companies do, around about the time of the dot-com bubble. I was running a software organization of over 300 software engineers, 10 product managers reporting directly to me, and a field sales force of over 1,000. And that company's now been acquired by Intel, and the tool chain that I architected is now the tool chain being used for their Internet of Things strategy. So I know the kind of stuff that's going to be used to build the next generation of the way in which the Internet's going to get evolved. So I've kind of got that kind of background. I'm going to use some cards because I've got a lot of stuff to cover today and I want to show you I'll stay somewhat connected. So, but through that, I also then came back to the UK about 10 years ago and sort of said, I want to spend time with my children. So I worked for myself as a consultant, did very well for that. But I took my technology skills into the marketing side. And I learned an awful lot about how the technology is used, how data on the internet is used to track us, profile us, engage with us, and utilize a knowledge of who we are in order to engage online. So a lot of kind of very well versed in things like LinkedIn and stuff like that. So I've kind of got that technology background, and I've got a marketing background, and some of my clients in the consultancy side were very much in the data systems world. A lot of background around how data is managed, how to define data, how to architect it, how to make it work for you. So that's kind of the sort of stuff. And in fact, some of the companies I've been working for 10 years are now at the chair of the board for the Industrial Internet of Things, as they're defining the way in which systems interoperability is going to be done for the Internet of Things. So quite well connected with those sorts of organizations and people. I'm going to do a small apology now because I'm going to get into a little bit of a doom-laden component of my view of the internet, because I fundamentally believe that it's a little bit broken. And I don't like the way in which it's evolving, and I'd like to see it change. And the way I want to do that is by creating a company that espouses different values, different ways of engaging. And I'm going to take you through that process today into a document that is very, very simple, just what I call my trust pyramid. And we'll get into that as I go through the presentation. In the latter half of it, we'll start to fill this in, and hopefully we'll be able to explain to you how we're thinking and why it's different. So, in the internet, probably the number one area of concern for me is this.
I've got a question.
Sorry.
Sorry for interrupting during your talk.
That's okay. That's fine. No, actually, I'd like a bit of interaction, so that's fine.
Sorry. But like overall, for like all the talks that I've gone through for this grad challenge so far, they've literally been saying the doom and gloom of the internet for like in the future. Do you think that you would also be able to elaborate on the positive sides?
I said the first half of my presentation will be a bit of doom and gloom.
So like you can like possibly see a brighter outlook.
I see a much more brighter outlook, yes. So, yeah, no, absolutely. Now, the first half will be a bit doom and gloom because, yeah, you've got to kind of set your context of the way the world is in order to be able to say how you want to change it. And everyone has a different perspective on how the way the world is. But, yeah, completely agree with you. So to me, the social network kind of epitomizes, in terms of applications on the internet, what's fundamentally broken. And so I decided, being the kind of person I am, to take on the social networking scene and say, actually, there's a better way of doing social networking. And this all started because when I said I came back to the UK to spend time with my children was really true. And as my child got towards teenage years, at 13, she said, Daddy, can I have a Facebook account? Now, you're not parents, so you probably won't understand, some of you are. But when you have the knowledge that I have of what exactly is happening with the data, how it's being used, and the way in which that's evolving, it scares the living hell out of you. So my answer to my child was, being a protective parent, not a chance in hell. And my wife just said one very simple thing, and she was, like wives often are, they're too bloody clever. I said, so what's the alternative? So that's when I started thinking about Krowdthink and how we could change the way the world is. So the way you have to look at things, because I've been in the commercial side for a very long time, the way the world is defined by the commercial engagement model. And the internet wouldn't have got started unless somebody came up with a commercial model that allowed them to take all these wonderful ideas of connecting the whole world together, and for us to be able to leverage all the fantastic elements of social networking, of internet connectivity, unless somehow or other it could be paid for. And the problem was, at that point in time, was that nobody actually had any idea of how useful the internet was going to be. Nobody could assign a value 15, 20 years ago to how beneficial it was going to be, and therefore nobody, in terms of you, the consumers, was sitting there saying, yeah, I'll pay for that. They were going, you've got to be kidding, man, I'm not going to pay for that. Right, so nobody was willing to pay. And that's the reality of the situation. So the question was, they had to come up with some approach. And the fundamental approach, completely appropriate at the time, because when you have that context, you have to understand it, is, well, that's fine, we'll advertise to you. You accept adverts, and we'll generate money from them, and you use our services, and just by engaging with us, essentially we can then monetize you. Okay, that's great. And nobody really cared, and that was wonderful. And the way the world moved on, and Google figured out how to do that in the search context, and they went supernova and killed the likes of Ask Jeeves and all those sorts of people. And the way the world evolved fundamentally changed. So that's great. But there's a problem with this. And time is, to me, perhaps the greatest educator. As somebody who's lived through more time than you, I feel that I've been educated in some ways more than you have. And you're going to learn a lot of these things. So that's why I'm here today, so hopefully to pass some of that on. And the thing that's beginning to get understood, not just by smart people like yourselves in this room, but by the consumers in general, is that they're being profiled. And they're being tracked. In fact, as they've got mobile devices, they're being tracked and profiled more and more. And the real problem is that for these advertising entities to be successful and to continue to grow, because that's their job, and to continue to make money, they have to track you and profile you with ever greater detail. So in fact, the whole internet model is basically set up to profile and track you, and as a consequence of that, determine ever more insightful perspectives of who you are psychologically. And you can do all the things that you think you can do to hide that. And I've spoken to many students, that's okay, I'm very careful about what I post online. It's irrelevant what you post online. It helps. The real issue is the fact that you're engaging. And just by engaging online, you're communicating an awful lot about yourself. So when you do stuff, who you do it with, how you do it, what services you select to use to do that, All of these things are the things that profile you and define you. So what you say just adds a little bit of context at the tail end of that massive data pool. And the big data pool about you is not the data, it's the metadata. That's what these advertising companies create. And it's incredibly insightful. The data aggregator business in the US right now is around about, well, in fact, nobody can put a real number on it. It's a multi-billion-dollar business. And all they do is they talk to different advertising companies and they buy data. And they aggregate it, and they correlate it, and then they sell it on to somebody else who wants to target you with ever more accuracy. And that's the fundamentals of what's paying for the internet today. It's a multi-billion-dollar business. And I don't like that. Because I have a fundamental understanding that there is no such thing as a secure system. And just because I go online to engage with somebody, to have a conversation, does not give anybody the right to psychologically analyse me. And to me, that's the core problem with the way in which the internet is today. Now, what I'm not going to do today, you notice I'm very much talking about the commercial side. I'm not going to talk about the whole governmental side, about how they're leveraging this, so the Snoopers Charter and the Patriot Act and all those things, because they overlap as issues, but to me, the real issue that hasn't really been brought into debate is the commercial model of the internet, and that's the issue that I think we should be focusing on. What governments do ultimately is regulated, is ultimately managed, because we do, in general, unless you're in a dictatorship, have the opportunity to vote people out, vote people in, and hopefully, change the way in which we're being secured and protected. Because ultimately, they only do this to secure and protect us. So they do actually have a genuine, ethically valuable reason for doing what they're doing. They may overextend their means, and they may end up inhibiting free speech and all sorts of stuff. But actually, I have less of a concern about those activities than I do about the commercial entity. And the reason for that is this: in corporate law, the director of every company has one responsibility only: to maximize the revenues for his company and to increase the profits. Now, in the internet economy, that is done by one way and one way only: more data, more profiling, more psychological insight as to who you are. So by definition, the directors of the company are financially and corporately legally required to get more stuff out of you. That's their job. So it's a bit doom and gloom, so we'll get to the more positive side. So, however, I will say this: you do have to watch what the governments do, because very often the way in which they operate is that they accept that their people won't allow them to monitor them and track them in ways that they would like, so they force the large commercial entities to act as their proxies, to do it on their behalf, and create these lovely little honeypots of data which they can dip into whenever they want to do a little bit of security management. So we do have to be very careful about that. But I am going to focus much today on the commercial side of the equation. So we have an advertising rat race as the core of the problem. And there's ever deeper insight into who you are, what your psyche is. But what's really scary now is that things are beginning to change. Most of you have probably heard about what Facebook did a little while back, where they actually did a psychological experiment. And without telling anybody, they went onto Facebook and they started to pump content into people's feeds, with the sole purpose of seeing if they could change the way in which people thought. This is getting pretty scary. And they were successful. They were able to nudge people's perspectives and values in a both positive and negative direction by several percentage points. And this is the very first public experiment that they ever did. Imagine if they refine and define and build this kind of technology, and it starts getting used by those governments that want to use these honeypots. Ooh, Now you say, well, you're getting a conspiracy theory. No, I'm not. This is happening. Right? It's being done. It's unregulated. And that's pretty scary, because that kind of stuff, that experimental activity, is unregulated, and it's evolving. And if they can figure out a way to make money, they have to use it, because that's their job, to make more money out of you. So that's pretty scary. And metadata is the key to it all. I want to go to a side just for a second, because there's an excuse that's put out there very often by these companies.
Geoff, can you explain what you mean by metadata? Maybe some of the guys wouldn't understand that term.
Okay, I think I did a few minutes ago, but I'll go back over it. There's a difference between the data, in other words, what you post, the content of your messages, right? And that's very different from the metadata, which is the information about when you posted it, who you sent it to, who else was doing it at the same time, what service you used to do that. All of those things are metadata. They're the data about the data. So that's metadata. I mean, there are theorists and philosophers that say there's no such thing as metadata because it's all data. Well, that's true. I'm just using the term metadata to differentiate between the two types that most people would understand. Is that clear? Yeah. Okay. So the big thing that, big excuse that most of these entities say is, don't worry, it's all anonymized. So you're all safe. Don't have to worry about all this profiling because we're not profiling you, we're just profiling these entities and it's all anonymized and we're all perfectly safe. So isn't that wonderful? Except there ain't no such thing. In fact, the bigger the data gets, the more likely it is to get aggregated, the more likely it is to be correlated, and at some point the data set will get so large that the fact that it doesn't put your real name on it is absolutely completely irrelevant. Because it is you. And those data sets are being evolved. Let me give you a simple example. They talk about anonymization of location data. This is a very, very simple one. If we take a data set of the movements of 1 million people, if I could identify 4 bits of time-correlated data about you, I could then research that database and de-anonymize it with 95% accuracy, and I'd only need 4 data points to do that. This is just for location data, which, by the way, is the scariest of all data. We'll talk about that in a minute. It's been mathematically proven that that is all you actually need. And let's guys think about that for a second. Well, okay, could I find 4 bits of data about you? Well, if I knew something about you, I could probably find your address. If you had children, I'd probably know which school you went to, or take them to. Or if you worked, I know where you work. So I could probably, and I know that's probably around about 9 o'clock you go and 5 o'clock you return. So I'll look through the database for those data points, and I'll just search for that. And I will then be able to de-anonymize all of the rest of the movement data about you with 95% accuracy. It doesn't matter how you obfuscate that. That's the reality of de-anonymization. And the reason I know this is true is that when the legislators try to legislate it, for our own Information Commissioner's Office, which tries to protect us all, in their own anonymization guidance document, their guidance says, in the very first sentence, please ensure that it's not likely to be de-anonymized. So you're allowed to de-anonymize and claim it's anonymized as long as it's not likely to be de-anonymized. Well, ask any lawyer what that basically means. It means cart and horses, drive through, do whatever the hell you like, as long as you can cover your ass. Right? That's the way the law works. So at this point in time, our government is busily pushing out this agenda of, let's get all this big data. It's all going to be anonymized. We're all perfectly safe. So let's tell all these consumers that you've got nothing to worry about. And while at the same time, they know full well that they can't write legislation that protects us. Because anonymization doesn't work. So that's pretty scary. It gets worse than that, though. Unfortunately, I'm going to go a little bit more down the doom road, because that data's kept forever. The internet doesn't forget. So what you collate today, and you put protections on, 20 years from now, when you're just reaching your middle age and you're having your children, that data's going to resurface in some fashion. Or 50 years from now. Nobody's actually the internet hasn't lived that long. We have no idea how we're going to manage that kind of data and secure it and keep ourselves protected from that information set. So, and no data, and this is the other bit, no system is capable of being built that is ultimately secure. So the more valuable that honeypot of information is over time, the more likely it is to happen, the more likely it is that we're all going to experience an intrusion upon our privacy because of a lack of protection around that data. It's not that people didn't try, I'm sure they are. It's just no such thing as a secure system. And anybody who builds secure systems knows this. It's all a question of whether or not you put adequate levels of security in so that if the law comes after you, you can say, well, we did our best. But that was your best 20 years ago. And by the way, if it's the government doing it, and the government, good luck taking on the government and holding them to account under the law. You don't have much chance. So it's just fundamentally not secure. It's going to be around for a hell of a long time. And we have no, it's really bad. We don't even know it exists. You cannot find the data that's about you. You don't know who's got it. You don't know what they're doing with it. You don't know how they're using it. And you have no way to go and look at it and say, hang on a second, that's not true. This data set that you've collected, that's 80% right, but this 20%, no, that's not me. You've got no way of doing that with the way in which the internet is evolving. But when we look at our digital society and you look at these sorts of problems, you go, Jesus Christ, we've got a problem. We're storing up a load of world of shit for ourselves. Or are we? Well, I think we can actually address this, but we need to, we need to get angry. Right? We need to get angry about the fact that this is happening and it's just occurring amorphously around us without any thought process about what's really going to be the consequences for us. And let's have the consequences to figure them out later. No, I don't want to suffer the consequences. We're smart people. We can see what's going to come down the road. Why don't we, you guys here in this room, that's why you're here today, I'm hoping a few of you will pick up and go, I don't want that world to be that way. I want it to be different. How do you do that? I want you to get angry enough to say, that is a really big and important issue. Let's get out and do something. So, we have to ask ourselves the basic question is, when do we start allowing computers to shift from being a tool to service our individual needs to a tool for commercial entities to productize and sell us? That's what the internet has done. We need to get back to what computers were designed for, to serve us as individuals. That's what we need to get back to. To do that, we need to address things like the fact that we've got no control, no visibility. We've not really consented to this engagement. We need to validate this information. Let me ask a quick question. How many of you have got mobile smartphone devices? Every single one. How many of you on O2? Can you ring 1300 for me? Have you got signal?
Yeah.
Okay.
Not loudspeaker.
That's okay. You just... Now, by default, when you bought that SIM card off O2, you opted in to having your location permanently tracked by O2 for them to sell to whoever they like for whatever purpose they want. This is the society we're living in, guys. Right? This is the consent model. Ha-ha. Right? You consented to that. Did you know you consented to that?
No.
How do you feel about consenting to that?
Awful.
Right. Exactly. That's my point. Now, the interesting thing is, every single one of you in this room did the same thing. As far as I'm aware, the last time I saw a study on this, only 3, anybody got a phone using 3? Only 3 wasn't doing this. They might be doing it now. I haven't looked in the last year and a half. But the last time I looked, that was the information. And I found this I'm on O2, so I decided to go and, I'm on one of these nutters, I go and actually look at my privacy policy. And on page 1, on the first page, it's not there. I actually go through another level. And then I thought, oh, hang on a minute, there's something a bit fishy going there. They're trying to hide something. Got third level down, and then I eventually found this bit that says, if you want to opt out of the location-based tracking services that we're using to commercialise where you are, dial 1300. For fuck's sake. And that's consent. The law for privacy requires 2 things. Informed consent. Well, I gave my consent. I don't remember being informed. Transparency, that kind of stuff. That's what we really need in the way in which the internet works today. So, I just want to go on a quick aside on legislation. So I'm just go off to that side and I'll come back again. But I think it's worth setting a couple of things on context. The first thing you need to understand about legislation is it's fundamentally different on different countries. In the context of privacy. In America, when you go online, you have no fundamental right to privacy. There are no laws, in essence. The US government, when the internet first evolved, made an explicit decision to say, we will not regulate because we want the commercial society to figure out how to evolve the internet. And as a commercial decision for America PLC, fantastic idea. That's where they got Facebook, Google. None of these guys were hindered by any kind of ethical concerns or commercial concerns. They just went out and did whatever they could to make money. And they made these massive, humongous elements. And whereas in Europe, we had the Data Protection Act and Human Rights Act, and we had to comply. And no wonder Ask Jeeves and people like that got completely crushed, because they were constrained, they were constricted, right? And in the early stages, because nobody kind of understood the world that they were building, what am I doing on time? Nobody understood the world they were building, nobody was actually asking the right questions 10, 15 years ago. So they were just engaging and sucking in all that benefit that the internet gives. And they're going, this is wonderful, the internet's fantastic. And it is, and it was, and it still is today. It's a tremendous tool. I just don't like the fundamental precepts of the way in which it's being built. So, when you think about legislation, there's several components to it. So there is the privacy legislation. There's also the communications infrastructure legislation, which is a different set of legislation that mandates companies like me to potentially keep track of certain types of data for potential security concerns. Now, actually interesting, because I'm a social network, I currently fall outside of that. And I can enable communication across the internet without actually being required to record every element of what you do. At the moment, until the Super Charter comes in, that will change. And David Cameron wants us to stop encrypting everything that we do. Really? Or if we do encrypt it, give him the keys to the encryption. Really? And we can trust these people with it? Or worse than that, the other thing he said in the statement in the Commons was, no, actually what we want you to do is we want you to monitor the people on your social network to make sure that they're not, fascists or ISIS members. I'm going, and who's going to monitor the people I employ to make sure that all the other data that they look at and see about your private lives isn't going to get utilised in ways that it shouldn't? How do I suddenly become a police force? Why should I be trusted with that? Why should I force that kind of level of trust on my employees? But that's the kind of thought process that seems to be going on, at the governmental level. And give another example. GCHQ, wonderful security service, but they did a nasty little hack into a company called Gemalto. Anybody know who Gemalto is? Gemalto makes the vast majority of SIMs that go into your phone. The SIM is the fundamental security building block of every communication that you do on your phone. Without the SIM, there is no security, and there's also no communication. By being able to hack into that, they can now hack into absolutely any phone conversation from any phone anywhere in the world that uses a Gemalto SIM. Well, that's really good for security. I'm not quite so sure it's good for society. Especially when you say all that data could be there for 20 years and, will they really keep it secure? And if that gets revisited on me 20 years from now, will that be a good thing or a bad thing? However, some good news. Hey, okay, I'm going to start moving down to the positive side of things. Right. So, the positive side of the story. Legislation is coming because, I'm not the only guy sitting here going, I understand this shit and it's really bad. The legislative processes have been going on for years around this. And the Data Protection Act is about to go through a huge fundamental update. And it will come in place around about beginning of 2016. And the UK, if we're still in the EU, will have to, by the way, I kind of, only if for no reason alone, I probably will vote for the EU. For this reason alone, we will have to comply within 12 months. So by beginning of 2017, we will have a new set of regulation. And the really good news is it's going to have teeth, really big teeth. At the moment, if you're a big company and you flout the law and you get caught, whoopie-doo, you'll get caught for about 150, 250k's worth of fines. It's the cost of doing business. Right? And that is the culture, by the way, of all of these internet companies operating, and particularly the American companies that weren't regulated. They just look at Europe and go, what a joke of a regulatory system. We'll just continue doing whatever we want to do. We'll throw some lawyers at it, and if we do get caught, we'll pay the fine. So it's like, in the new regulation, a data breach will be redefined. It'll be a much stronger definition. And a privacy breach will be a much stronger definition. And the fines will now be €100 million, or 5% of your turnover, whichever is bigger. So finally, we're going to see some regulation with teeth. We're going to see some regulation that is fundamentally advanced and is actually going to assist us as individuals or companies, depending on how you're operating, to start to reinforce some of the values and principles that we want to see delivered. Now, Back in 1997, the Information Commissioner's offices from around the world got together and said, we're screwed. These are the guys looking after us, regulator. And they basically said, we're screwed because there's absolutely no way we're going to have the resources, nor, in fact, the regulatory powers to police the internet. And they sat there and went, we're so screwed, we can't do our jobs. And yet we're funded to do this job. And this was back in 1997. And they basically sat down and said, what we really need is companies to embrace a set of principles of operating so that our job is made easier. And they came up with 7 principles called privacy by design. If you look, you can look this up on the internet. I won't write these up, but I'm going to quickly run through them because I don't have time to go through them in detail, but I'll just read them out for you. So, number 1, be proactive, not reactive. Preventative, not remedial. So, in other words, think about privacy at the outset, try and construct it in a positive way. Don't think about having to solve problems, think about avoiding the problems in the first place. Second one, privacy as the default setting. So, I will mention my app here for a second. There's no privacy settings in my Crowd app. I don't need them, because by default, we've built an app that we feel is fundamentally private by design. So there's no private. If you think about it, privacy settings is an answer about face mechanism. It's saying the company has control of my privacy, and it's going to give me back some level of control through a few settings. Is that me having privacy, or is that them allowing me some level of privacy, but just on the stuff that I know about? So in Facebook, for example, there are no privacy settings related to your metadata. None whatsoever. They own all that. And you don't have any control over their ability to collate it and utilize it in any way they like. But the data, yes, because the average consumer can see the data, so they're all foolish enough to think that's what they need to worry about. Privacy embedded into the design. So the way in which you design and build your applications should say, let's make privacy a key objective. Full functionality, positive sum, not zero sum. So there's an awful lot of people say, yes, but if you build privacy in, there's all sorts of things you can't do. We can't enable the way in which we can't compete with Google because if we build privacy in, we can't deliver it. No, there are search engines that deliver privacy. There's LX Start, there's DuckDuckGo, there's all sorts of people like that who can build privacy in by design. So you don't have to have it. And in fact, my view is, and we'll get to that at the end perhaps, is that actually as the consumers wake up to the issues that are facing them in the digital society, privacy becomes a commercial asset. And I'll talk about that at the end. End-to-end security. Well, that's fairly obvious. If I do hold data about you, then it's my job to secure it, and that means all the communications as well. So end-to-end security, fairly blatantly obvious. Visibility and transparency, keep it in the open. Completely agree with that. How do you know it's private unless the way in which you engage is actually delivered in that manner? And 7th one, respect for user privacy. Keep it user-centric. So in other words, stop building products solely for your company. First build a product for your user, really for the user, from the privacy perspective, and you'll end up with a better product. And if you do all these things, the information commissioners will be able to protect us much better because their job will be massively reduced. And the world I'd like to see is a world that builds all of their systems for the internet private by design. That's where we should be getting to. And the mechanisms, strategies, structures, principles are all in place. The tools are out there. It's possible to do. We've built it. In fact, we're hoping to be the very first certified private by design social network in the world. Because there is a certification process that's looking like it will come together later this year, and we're in discussions with them. And if they get that certification process in place, we're already talking to those people, say, get us certified. Right? Because it embodies the kinds of principles that we believe in. But what it's really about is about redefining the culture of the way in which your company develops its products. You have the ability to go out and build companies. Think about the culture of the way in which you build that, the culture of the people that you want, the people that you're going to engage with. Every single person, from the secretary through the admin person through to the programmer, should all be thinking about how do they deliver a constructive, private by design solution for their users. So here's one I'm going to get screwy. I think the privacy debate's a little bit misdirected. Because it ends up being focused on things like privacy settings, which I just mentioned a minute ago, isn't really about real privacy. It's about obfuscating what's really going on. And the commercial entities are continuously using their compliance or not with privacy legislation, which is always at least 10 years behind the technology's capability. At least 10 years behind the technology's capability. And it doesn't matter how fast you try and move it, it's always, the perverse thing about privacy by design is that the ICOs themselves are always implementing reactive legislation. It's very, very difficult for them to get ahead of the curve. Now, the EU Data Protection Act changes might actually, in some areas, slightly get ahead of the curve. They're doing things like talking about the right to delete in the social networks, and I think that's a proactive thing. It's a bit late, but it will be actually significantly help. So the question is, what is privacy online? Actually, we talk about privacy, and you go, what the hell is it? I think if I actually spoke to every single one of you, what you consider to be private in a communication exchange will be different. And if I went to Iran, the culture of the people there would redefine that. And if I went to another country, the culture of people there would redefine that. If I went to a man and a woman, I'd probably see a difference between the way in which they perceive privacy. For example, in Iraq, we allow people to see who's in the location that they're in, and the women and the men will go, that's really great, I can do this, this, and this. The women's action was, that's really cool, but can I hide myself from certain people? Because that's the privacy they wanted. Now, I know there's some creepy guys around, and I just don't want them to even know I'm around. But I do want to use all the other assets you took. So how do you build that in? So we're thinking about, how do you do that? My point is that every one of us has a slightly different definition of what privacy is. However, we can all agree on one thing, I think, and certainly the law thinks this, and I tend to agree with this, is where legislative process does meet real reality, and that is that we can all agree when a privacy breach occurs. Privacy breach occurs when the information that I provided is used in a way that I didn't understand it was going to be used in a way differently to the way I understood it at the time I exchanged it. So in other words, when I exchange information, I have a context of use. And by exchanging it, I'm empowering the recipient to say, yeah, you can use this data, and I have a pretty fundamental understanding of how you're going to use it, and that's okay. Because I've communicated to you. If you use that data in another way, you're starting to impinge upon my privacy. To me, that is the fundamentals of what privacy is about. And really, regulation doesn't really cover that, and neither does commercial implementation as it exists on the internet today. But it does start with an approximation. So we've got some building blocks, but the company itself has to rethink how to do this. Now, so in this context, I actually say, well, privacy is kind of misdirected. I think that's almost a third level down issue. Above that is actually the question of who's empowered in the communication exchange that's going on. Because at the moment on the internet, the company, the commercial entity, is empowered because they are in complete control of all of the data and the metadata, and they get to choose what to do with it. And the only choice you have in theory is, if you understand it, which we've just proven that you don't, that you are deciding whether or not to engage with that service. Except that we don't really have that because many of the services are so ubiquitous we can't not engage with them. So empowerment is a critical issue, and I think we need to shift the empowerment process in the way in which applications and systems are built online to one where we're seeking to empower you, the consumer, with those rights. And the question is, how do you do that? But there's a bigger issue than that, because actually, I don't really have time when I go online to be thinking about all of this sort of stuff. I mean, it's nice to know that I'm being empowered, but in reality, I've got getting on with other stuff. So there's something even bigger and more important than privacy, which is empowerment. There's something bigger and even more important than empowerment, and to me, that's trust. The question is, for the service provider that you're using, or service providers, which you are using, do I fundamentally trust that they're delivering a service that is actually basically turning the internet into a tool for my use to empower me? So to me, the most important thing that we've got to aspire to is building systems which are trustworthy. And I say trustworthy because one of the things I said earlier on is there ain't no such thing as a secure system. So just by using the internet to engage, you have to accept that there's a potential that exchange of information could get hacked and used in ways that you don't understand. So that doesn't mean that the entity or commercial company that you build cannot aspire to be trustworthy. So that's, to me, it has to be the ultimate goal. So if we talk about empowerment, which is what I wanted to put here, we have to think about how we change the way in which we commercially engage online into an empowerment or an empowering engagement. And the absolute central tenet to all of this, to me, is control. Because the one thing we agreed earlier on in terms of privacy was that if we're in control of who we exchange with, and we trust that they're not going to use it in ways that are fundamentally against what I understood it to be used for, then I am empowered in that exchange. And privacy, actually, to me, comes down here. In fact, privacy by default, as we talked about earlier on in the principles of... So the big debate about privacy, to me, is misdirected, because it's down here. Empowerment is really what it's all about. Trust is what we should be seeking to obtain in terms of the way in which commercial entities are built. So the next component is, okay, let's say I've got that control. How do I know I've got that control? So the next component, again, somewhat inspired by privacy by design, is transparency. You have to be very clear about what data you've got and for what purpose you're using it. So, for example, on our website, we document every single type of data, including all the metadata components that can be attributed to you, and for what purpose we use them. It's all documented on there. Now, 99% of consumers don't understand that stuff, don't want to understand it, but the fact that even 1% can go and do that, and can go and hold us to account and debate, do you really need that bit of metadata? Can't you do the service that you're doing without that? That's great. I actually want to hear that. Oh, yeah, I didn't thought about doing it that way. That'd be brilliant. You know, that kind of engagement model, to me, is what we should be trying to aspire to in building social networks and, in fact, frankly, any online system. But the third component is about the realities of the way in which commercial entities have to operate, is because they have to make money, right? And the way in which their product, service, or whatever it might be could evolve may go into areas that I don't feel comfortable with. So I started using a product, I was really happy with it, but actually the way you're going right now, that ain't so good. I don't like that. And maybe that remedy is... Well, the question is, what kind of remedy should that be? If we go back to what the commercial value proposition of every internet company is, it's the data, then it has to refer back to the data. So to me, this remedy capability has to embrace what's coming in the new legislation, which is great, but we've already built it into our system, is the right to delete. And that should be right down to the individual post. In other words, the fact that I said this to somebody 20 years ago, that's not me anymore, and I really don't want it out there, so I'm going to delete that. But to do that, you have to think about other issues, like, okay, during that period, it's been shared 20,000 times. And so therefore, when you build your systems and software, you have to think about the issues like data provenance. Where did it start? Where did it originate? Not where it is, but where did it originate? Because origination defines, to some extent, ownership. And if you're the original poster of that information, you want it to be removed, you want it not only to be removed from your account, but from every account that ever copied it. And that's what we've built into our system. So we think that true empowerment comes through a combination of embedded control. And this means that actually the way in which you build the user interface is intuitive, that there's private by design, the way in which I'm sharing information, I understand just by doing it that what's happening with the data. You really have to think about, is anything happening with the communication data other than that which I would intuitively understand by using this tool in this way? And you really have to know that you can go to look to this to say, yeah, I'm okay with that. That's cool. And if it does eventually evolve and develop as a product in a way that I'm happy with, I want to be able to remove my data. Now, unfortunately, right now, delete is the only real way of doing it, because something else which I spend an awful lot of time on is systems interoperability. And what should really, I'd actually eventually like to have, is the ability not to delete so much as move. I'd like to be able to remove my data from one social network and put it into another one which I now trust more. That's real empowerment in social networking online. Today we don't have that. I am working with an organisation called PDEC, which stands for the Personal Data Ecosystem Consortium. And they're doing some very interesting stuff, and I'm helping advise them and guide them on building systems interoperability. And one of the things they're building as a foundational building block is that they're saying every PDEC member has to build systems interoperability in to their systems for personal data, so that if an individual wants to move his data from service provider A to service provider B, he can just click a button and it'll happen. A bit like the way in which you currently click a button to change who you're getting your electricity from by going on, YouGov and USwitch or whatever it is, right? That's not here today. So in the meantime, Remedy is about as good as we can give right now. But I commit to you, I'm absolutely committed to, ultimately, the real issue is interoperability and data exchange and empowerment of the individual to move their data to a service provider that better serves their privacy needs. So then you have to say, well, okay, what kind of company is this all about? How do you build an entity that does this? Well, we talked about security already. So we have to inculcate into the way in which you build your company and your product secure by design. And anybody who builds systems with security in them will know one fundamental thing. You can't add it after the fact. It's virtually impossible to say, build a system and go, wow, this is really cool, now let's secure it. It does not work that way. If you don't think about security, the way in which you think about how to build a system in terms of communicating elements, if you're not thinking about securing all of the communication, by design, at the moment you write the first line of code, you will not be able to maximize the security opportunity in that product. Right? So anybody, if you ever see anybody on the internet going, yeah, we used to have a product, it wasn't secure, but it is now, bullshit. Right? Absolute bullshit. Guarantee you it's bullshit. It doesn't work that way. We also have another thought. Given that there's no such thing as a secure system, given that we have no such thing as a secure system, then given that hackers will get in, given that this will happen, the responsible thing as a company best practice and company culture to do is to think about how do I build every single feature minimizing the amount of personal data that I obtain from my users. In other words, totally the opposite from what every single internet company does today. Whenever they build a product, they think, hey, when I add this feature, I can get 10x more data, like this, and I can add that and I can sell it. That'd be great, right? So that mentality is fundamentally flawed for building a strong digital society. To me, we have to think about data minimization. It doesn't mean don't store data. It does mean store data. We need to store data. We need to hold it. We need to use it. We need to use it to leverage and deliver value. The question is, how little can we get away with to deliver that value? That, to me, is kind of a cultural thought process we really need to move and get into. It also means, because of the thing that made me angry, not data profiling. No covert profiling or tracking. Right? Central, to me, that's a fundamental commitment you have to make to people, is that you don't... Now, in our social network, there is a little bit of profiling, and we do that because we think that in order to engage other people, you need to have some initial perspective of who they are and how well engaged they are in our application, kind of a reputational indicator. But we publicize all of that data, and you can choose not to engage with our social network if that data, which is a very small set of data, is uncomfortable for you. So no covert profiling or tracking. Beyond that data, there's absolutely no other profiling or tracking data in our social network. And we think that's a really important point to make to people, because what's going on all the time is that profiling and tracking. O2 is doing it. Right? Every phone manufacturer is doing it. O2, the reason I knew that O2 was doing it, by the way, I was a little bit disingenuous. I don't just read the privacy by design, but the privacy policy. I actually spotted that Telefonica was building a data aggregator company behind their phone company. And I thought, and they were doing that about 2 years ago. I made a note to myself, 12 months from now, go read the privacy policy. Because I thought, they've got to be doing something. And the only bit of data that a phone company gets that nobody else gets is location data. So I actually knew, because they were building a company that was going to sell data, that they must be going to evolve their privacy policy so they could get that data to sell. So I kind of knew it was going to happen, and I went looking for it. So a little bit, disingenuous. But anyway, so no covert profiling or tracking. And finally, and this is the one that everybody always ends up asking, Well, okay. How are you going to make money? Now, when you're trying to change the way in which the internet is and you're engaging with a different type of social networking policy and profile and everything else, you've got a lot to prove. I mean, nobody is going to say, because you drew this lovely little diagram, Krowdthink, we're going to trust you. Because that's, I wouldn't advise it anyway. So we have to prove that trust through operation. We have to engage with people. So like many social networking apps, we're going to have to go out and offer it for free for quite a while. And of course, most, certainly American companies, what they do is, we'll figure out how to make money later. God, they're so disingenuous. They know exactly how they're going to make the money later, just not in detail. They're going to get data from you and they're going to sell it. That's basically, so why don't they just go and say, we're going to get data from you and we're going to sell it. Not one of them does that. They all say, well, we'll figure out our business model later. Because they're being a bit disingenuous, because they're saying, well, we haven't figured out exactly how we're going to do it, but we are going to do this, but we're not going to tell you that this is what we're going to do. So our view is that we have to be very open about that. And on our privacy page, because it's a privacy issue, is we document how we're going to make our money. And we're going to offer people 2 or 3 different options. One is pay for the app. Unlike when Facebook started, and I've got no problems with the Facebook business model as it is today, because it's inherently based upon the way the internet was at the beginning. I think they did absolutely the right thing, and they built something fantastic. And it's a fantastic tool. I just don't personally touch it with a barge pole, but it is a brilliant tool, and it has fantastically advanced the way the internet facilitates engagement. But today, back then, they had to build the entire server farm. They had to build the software infrastructure. They had to build everything from scratch. They needed a lot of money to do that. Today, I can go onto a cloud service provider and I can build and I've got a complete data model of exactly how much it's going to cost me per user depending on how much they use our service and how much data they solve, and I can articulate that down to a cent. Right? You can do that today. You couldn't do that when Facebook built their product. Right? So I'm not blaming Facebook. I'm just saying today, you now have the tools to go and financially model the way in which you are engaging with your users, and if you're not doing it, then you're being disingenuous. So we'll ask people to pay a cup of coffee. And I know I can say today, for around about the cost of a cup of coffee, or maybe a bit more per year, we will be able to provide our service. Would you pay that micropayment if we delivered all of this kind of value? Some people will. In reality, all the studies we've seen say most people won't, because they don't actually think they need to care about privacy or being empowered or trusting the supplier, because they just don't think enough about it. So you just have to be realistic about this. And you say, okay, well, we'll do advertising then. Except that advertising is a tracking tool. And even through all this anonymization stuff, the moment you click the button, you've just confirmed you meet a very detailed and very specific profile that put that advert on your page. So you've just confirmed who you are and that you meet this profile. So that's a wonderful bit of data. That's why the larger advertising companies make more money, and it's kind of like a roller coaster. The more money they make, the more money they can make, because the more data they get, the more clicks they get, the more accurate their data set becomes, and the more targeted they can make it, and so on and so forth. And so that's the way the business model goes. However, I do know of an organisation, and the guys on our board of directors, who's building a private by design advertising platform. So we'll say to our customers, either you pay or you accept adverts. It's up to you. But our adverts will be private by design, because we're going to use a service that is private by design. The third component is more of a function of the locality nature of our product. We've talked about location. To me, of all of the sets of metadata that exist, the average consumer already has demonstrated he understands one thing. Location is creepy. Right? They all understand that. You go onto there's plenty of studies to show, if you go onto an app store and the app requires location permissions, an awful lot of people just don't download by default. Especially if they can't explicitly see why that service is required. And they're very wise to do that. So we believe, because we are a location-based social network, that there are ways in which we can, and we've innovated in delivering location-based service without requiring location permissions, by the way. So you download our app, and you don't need to there's no location permissions, even though it's a location-based app. There's a bit of innovation that we did, which I won't go into right now. But we believe that once we've got that kind of trusted, localized engagement model, that we will be able to monetize a localized commercial engagement that allows us to build a new way in which we can do a cost-per-click system that doesn't expose any other data other than I'm right here, right now, and I'm interested in that service. And who I am is, by the way, a pseudonymous name in the crowd, so you don't actually know anything about me anyway, just that I'm in your vicinity and I'm willing to think about buying that hot dog at that stadium. And we've got a commercial model we want to build around that. So that's the kind of stuff that we've been thinking about. But we're very open about it. We publicise it on our webpage. An open business model is a building block for company culture and best practice. By the way, just a quick aside, anybody got a Microsoft phone? You may have noticed that almost all of the apps require location services.
Yeah, I turn off the location.
Yeah, but they need access to location permissions. The reason for that is, interestingly, Microsoft, an incredibly trusted major service provider, have made it so that any advertising function on their phone has to use their library services, and their library services by default turn on location services and allow them to track you. So that's just the way Microsoft is doing it. So they're kind of stopping, they're looking at O2 and what they're doing, and going, well, they're all doing it, so we're going to do it too. We're going to make sure that everybody who uses advertising on our phone provides location data to us, because Microsoft should be able to monetize that. It's all the big race for all that data. That's what they're up to. Anyway, that's it. I'm on time. Any other questions at the end there?
Well done. Sorry.
Yeah, I have a sort of quick question. Given the rolling privatisation of public property, do you think it's possible the government may in the future monetise its surveillance data? Because if it did,
Yes.
it would make them very, very lot of money.
They're already planning to monetize their... there's a huge amount of data locked up in universities, for example. They're desperately seeking, through the open data system model, a way to monetize that. So health data, for example, they're already working on and trying to say, how do we monetize this? And take away, I wrote to my MP when the care.data thing came out, for example. I said, not a chance in hell should you let that through. I mean, the whole implementation was just as scary as hell. They just hadn't thought it through. And I think if I remember right, I'm just trying to remember the numbers, but it was going to give access to the private health data of every single person in this country to around about 27,000 government employees. How the hell are you going to regulate and control 27,000 employees having unfettered access to anybody's private medical data? It's just bonkers. So, I mean, stuff like that is going to happen. It's not whether or not they should do it. I think absolutely they should think about doing it. But it's thinking about how you do it. You know, that's the problem. Yes?
You talked about the business model of the internet, that they collect data and they sell it and that keeps it moving.
Yep.
And black money pages only operate because they collect data and they sell it.
I mean, it's a slight generalization, but yes.
They can only run because they get funded. But my question is, do you see a positive role for ad blocking softwares?
Yeah,
Changing that
one of our board members is actually an advocate for privacy by design, and he's been taken on by AdBlock Plus because they're fighting some interesting battles in the European Union right now for effectively creating self-regulation. So one of the things I've often debated putting in here is a self-regulation button, sort of say actually the other element of what we should think about in empowerment is a self-regulation structure to the company entity. And I think the role of things like AdBlock Plus is that they're kind of redefining acceptability for data exchange. And what they're doing is kind of making clear what's acceptable and what's not acceptable. Now, that's their definition, but as long as they're open about what their definition is and that the people adopting to use AdBlock Plus have a fundamental understanding of what that means to them, then I think that's very good and very powerful and useful to advance and move the debate forward, because it requires the individual as a consumer to have a slightly improved level of understanding